When I look back, I can hardly remember when I first noticed things starting to change. Or if they'd always been this way, hidden just beneath the surface. My life had always been quiet. Predictable even. I was a mother, a wife, and I like to think I was a good daughter-in-law too. Taking in my husband's father, Henry, when he needed a place to stay. We never thought twice about it. He was family. Helping him felt like the right thing to do. Besides, I'd built my life around the belief that family means standing by one another. Even when times get hard. My husband, Nate, and I had been married 15 years. We had one child, our son, Connor, who turned 16 that summer. Connor was a bright kid, with dreams of college and career aspirations that I wanted more than anything to support. If I'm honest, I wanted to give him the life I never had growing up. I'd always imagined sending him off to school with a fund saved just for him. Something he could rely on. It would be proof of our love and our commitment to his future. So, when Henry needed a place to stay, we welcomed him in without question. He'd lost his job after the company he'd been with for 20 years downsized. And with his health in decline, finding work at his age had become nearly impossible. Nate didn't want his father to feel like a burden. And I didn't either. We fixed up the guest room, making it comfortable for him, and welcomed him into our lives in a way we hoped would make him feel at home. In the beginning, everything was fine. Henry mostly kept to himself, spending his time watching old game shows or fixing things around the house when we needed it. He'd always been a bit of a quiet man, preferring his own company, but he never interfered with our routine. Over time, Connor grew close to him, bonding over card games and stories Henry would tell about his younger days. In my heart, I felt that we'd made the right choice bringing him in, after all. I wanted Connor to understand what it meant to take care of family. But even then, there were small signs that I'd ignored. Tiny warnings I brushed aside. Once, when Henry was watching a late-night poker tournament, I noticed his eyes light up in a way I hadn't seen before. I thought it was a harmless thrill, something he could enjoy in the safety of our home. He sometimes commented about strategies he'd seen the players use. And once or twice he even joked that he might have had a future in cards if life had gone a different way. I laughed along, not knowing that behind those laughs, something darker lingered. As the years passed, our focus remained on Connor's future. Every extra dollar, every holiday bonus and overtime shift I worked, went into the college fund. I kept careful tabs on it, watching it grow bit by bit, like nurturing a small garden. Some of my friends and even Nate had teased me about being overly frugal, skipping out on vacations or fancy dinners. But to me, it was all worth it if it meant Connor would never have to struggle to follow his dreams. I wanted him to have choices I never had, a chance at a life that was bigger than mine. Then, small hints started to appear, small, but impossible to ignore. I'd find Henry's phone screen open to online poker sites when I went to wake him up in the morning. Or he'd mention names of lottery winners, people who'd struck it big, almost wistfully, as if he too was waiting for his own lucky break. I tried to shake it off, chalking it up to harmless hobbies or even boredom. After all, he was retired and didn't have much else to occupy his time. But somewhere in the back of my mind, the doubts crept in, like little whispers I tried to ignore. What I didn't realize was that this wasn't just some idle pastime for him. It wasn't just harmless fun. What I didn't see then was how far he'd let himself fall into the hole that would eventually swallow our entire family whole. As I look back now, I sometimes wonder if I was blind out of choice. Maybe it was easier to ignore those early warnings, to let myself believe that everything was fine. After all, I had so much riding on this family. We'd built our dreams, our plans, and especially Connor's future. I suppose that's why the shock, when it finally came, hit me harder than anything I'd ever faced. But back then, in those early days, I had no reason to suspect the truth. The thought never even crossed my mind. I was just a mother, a wife, and a daughter-in-law, doing my best to hold our lives together. The day I discovered the truth, it was as if someone had pulled the ground out from under me. It started with a single envelope in the mail. A simple, inconspicuous letter from the bank, just a statement, as plain and mundane as anything else in our lives. When I opened it, my first thought was that there had been some mistake. I must have stared at the numbers for several minutes, willing them to change, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The balance was far lower than it should have been. Shockingly so. It didn't seem possible. I blinked, my heart pounding as I flipped through the transaction history, each withdrawal like a punch to the gut. They weren't large amounts, but they were steady, creeping out of the account like a slow leak I hadn't noticed until it was nearly drained. I'd worked so hard, sacrificed so much for this fund, and in an instant, I saw it slipping through my fingers. Each small withdrawal seemed to carry a message I couldn't ignore, a betrayal I wasn't ready to face. At first, I thought it was a bank error, or perhaps my husband had made some withdrawals without mentioning it. That's what I wanted to believe. Anyway, but a knot of fear twisted in my stomach as I considered the pattern of the withdrawals, the frequency, the amounts, the secrecy of it all. My hands shook as I set the statement down, a cold dread creeping over me as I realized I had to confront the possibility that someone in our home was responsible. My husband, Nate, was just as shocked when I showed him the statement. I saw the color drain from his face, and for a moment, I almost felt guilty for showing him, for forcing him to face something he clearly didn't want to believe. But I had no choice. I needed answers. We spent hours going over every detail, retracing our steps, desperate to find some other explanation, some way to make sense of it. But deep down, I think we both knew who was behind it. We just didn't want to admit it. Finally, we decided we had to confront Henry. Nate was hesitant. He didn't want to accuse his father of something so serious, especially when we had no proof beyond a few bank statements. But I couldn't let it go. My son's future was on the line, and I wasn't going to sit by and watch it disappear without a fight. When we finally sat Henry down, he didn't even try to deny it. He looked at us with a strange mixture of shame and defiance, as if he were both guilty and unapologetic at the same time. He mumbled something about just borrowing the money, saying he planned to return it as soon as he'd won enough to make up for the withdrawals. He claimed he'd been trying to get ahead, to help out in his own way, but the words sounded hollow, empty. I could barely process what I was hearing. I wanted to scream, to tell him that he'd destroyed everything we'd worked for, that he'd stolen from his own grandson's future, but I was too stunned, too numb to say anything. Instead, I sat there in silence, watching as the reality of what he'd done slowly sank in. It felt as if he'd taken a knife and driven it straight into my heart. This wasn't just about money, it was about trust, about the bond we'd built as a family, the sacrifices we'd made to support one another, and he'd thrown it all away for a chance at something he'd never truly had a chance at luck. In the days that followed, I felt as if I were living in a nightmare. Everywhere I turned, I saw reminders of what we'd lost, the college brochures Connor had collected, the savings jar we'd kept in the kitchen, the list of scholarships I'd spent hours researching. Each reminder felt like a slap in the face, a cruel reminder of the future that had slipped through our fingers. I tried to focus on the practical side of things, on finding a way to rebuild what he'd taken, but it felt like an impossible task. Years of savings, gone in a matter of months. I withdrew from everyone, even from Connor. I couldn't bear to look at him, to see the hope and trust in his eyes, knowing that I'd failed him, that I'd let his future be stolen right out from under us. Nate tried to reassure me, to tell me that we'd find a way to make it right. But I could see the strain in his eyes, the anger simmering just beneath the surface. We were both caught in a web of betrayal and disappointment, and neither of us knew how to untangle ourselves from it. After the initial shock wore off, we tried to find a way to move forward, to pick up the pieces of our shattered lives. Nate suggested that his father might be able to pay us back, little by little, perhaps by selling some of his belongings or picking up odd jobs to make up for what he'd taken. I wanted to believe it, to believe that there was a way to fix this. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. Henry's addiction had a hold on him, a grip that wouldn't be broken by promises or half-hearted attempts at restitution. But I agreed to give him a chance, to let him prove that he was willing to change, to make amends. It was the least I could do. I told myself, after all, he was family, and family deserved a second chance, didn't they? So I watched as he made his promises, as he assured us that he'd go to a support group, that he'd do whatever it took to make things right. For a while, it almost seemed as if he meant it, as if he were truly committed to making a change. But as the weeks passed, it became clear that his promises were as empty as the account he'd drained. He missed meetings, avoided conversations about his progress, and seemed to retreat further into himself with each passing day. Each broken promise felt like another wound, another reminder of the betrayal that had torn our family apart. And with each passing day, I felt my patience wear thinner, my tolerance for his excuses dwindling to nothing. Meanwhile, our finances were in shambles. We'd sacrificed so much over the years. Skipped vacations, driven used cars, saved every penny we could all for the future we'd planned for Connor. And now, that future felt uncertain, as if it was slipping through our fingers no matter how hard we tried to hold on. I found myself lying awake at night, staring at the ceiling, wondering how we'd ever recover from this, how we'd ever find a way to rebuild what he'd taken. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't escape the weight of what had happened. It hung over me like a dark cloud, casting a shadow over every moment, every interaction. I felt trapped, suffocated by the anger and resentment that simmered just beneath the surface, threatening to consume me. And yet, I couldn't bring myself to confront him again, to demand that he leave. I was afraid of what it would mean, of the damage it would do to our family, to my son. But deep down, I knew that something had to change. I couldn't keep living like this. Couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine when it clearly wasn't. I had to find a way to move forward, to protect my son's future, even if it meant making a choice I'd never imagined I'd have to make. I don't think I ever truly knew what it felt like to be broken until that day. For months, I'd tried to hold on, clinging to the hope that somehow, things would improve, that we'd find a way to rebuild what we'd lost. But hope is a fragile thing, and it can only withstand so much before it begins to shatter under the weight of reality. The breaking point came on a quiet Saturday afternoon. Connor had been in his room, doing homework, when he called out to me, asking if we could talk about college applications. I could hear the excitement in his voice, the eagerness of a boy on the cusp of becoming a man, ready to set out into the world and make a life for himself. And in that moment, my heart broke a little more. I wanted nothing more than to sit with him, to pore over brochures and discuss his dreams, to share in the excitement of his future. But all I could feel was a deep, unrelenting ache, a hollow emptiness that reminded me of the promises I could no longer keep. I joined him anyway, putting on a brave face, trying to focus on his dreams instead of the doubts gnawing at me. He talked about his favorite schools, about programs and scholarships, each word a reminder of what we'd lost. I nodded along, forcing myself to smile, to hide the truth from him. But he must have sensed something was wrong because, after a while, he grew quiet, looking at me with a puzzled expression, as if trying to read my thoughts. "Mom, are you okay?" he asked, his voice gentle, full of concern. For a moment, I wanted to tell him everything, to lay bare the truth, to let him see the scars of the betrayal that had torn our family apart. But I couldn't bring myself to do it. Connor didn't deserve to carry the weight of our mistakes, of the choices that had led us here. So, I smiled and told him I was fine, that I was just a little tired. He seemed to accept it. But as he went back to his room, I felt a crushing sense of guilt, a weight so heavy it was almost impossible to breathe. I knew then that I couldn't go on like this. I couldn't keep pretending, couldn't keep letting Henry's presence tear our family apart. It wasn't just about the money anymore, it was about the trust that had been shattered, the future that had been stolen. And no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't forgive him, couldn't find a way to let go of the anger and resentment that burned inside me. It was like a poison, seeping into every corner of my life, tainting everything it touched. That night, as I lay awake beside Nate, I made the decision. I didn't want to do it, didn't want to be the one to tear our family apart. But I knew I had no choice. For months, I tried to fix things, to hold on to the fragile threads of our lives. But it was no use. Henry's presence was a wound that would never heal, a constant reminder of what we'd lost. And I knew that as long as he was here, we would never be able to move forward. The next morning, I asked Nate to sit down with me. I could see the worry in his eyes, the exhaustion etched into his face. And for a moment, I almost wavered. But I knew that this was something I had to do, that it was the only way to protect what was left of our family. Taking a deep breath, I told him everything: how I felt, how I couldn't go on living like this, how I needed to put our son's future first, even if it meant making a choice that would hurt us all. Nate listened in silence, his expression unreadable, and for a moment, I wondered if he'd try to talk me out of it, to convince me that we could find another way. But he didn't. Instead, he nodded slowly, his eyes filled with a sorrow I couldn't bear to see. He understood, even if it hurt him. He knew that this was something we had to do, that we couldn't keep sacrificing our family's future for someone who couldn't see beyond his own addiction. When we finally sat Henry down to tell him, the words stuck in my throat, thick and heavy, each one a wound that cut deep. He looked at us with a mixture of disbelief and anger. As if he couldn't fathom why we were doing this. Why we were turning him out after all we'd shared. I tried to explain, tried to make him understand that this wasn't about hate or punishment, it was about survival. About protecting what was left of our family. But he wouldn't hear it. He accused us of abandoning him, of giving up on him when he needed us most. And each word felt like a slap in the face. A reminder of the love I'd once felt. A love that had been twisted beyond recognition. As he packed his things and left, I felt a strange mix of relief and sorrow. A hollow ache that settled deep in my chest. Part of me wanted to reach out, to pull him back, to tell him that I still cared, that I still wanted him to be a part of our lives. But I knew it was too late. The damage had been done, the trust broken beyond repair. And as he walked out the door, I felt a sense of finality, a bittersweet release that left me feeling both lighter and emptier than I'd ever felt before. In the days that followed, the house felt eerily quiet. Henry's absence was like a missing piece, a void that reminded us of the fracture that had split our family apart. For a time, Nate and I moved through our days in silence, each of us carrying our own private grief, our own unspoken regret. I found myself retreating into the routines of daily life, finding comfort in the mundane tasks that kept my hands busy and my mind distracted. But the nights were harder. As I lay awake, the weight of what we'd done pressed down on me, a guilt that gnawed at the edges of my heart. I couldn't help but wonder if I'd made the right choice, if there had been some other way to fix things, to protect my family without tearing us apart. But deep down, I knew that this was the only path left to us, the only way to ensure that Connor's future would remain secure, untarnished by the mistakes of those who'd come before him. Gradually, life began to settle into a new rhythm. Nate and I focused on rebuilding, on finding ways to make up for what we'd lost. We revisited our finances, looked for ways to cut costs, and I even took on extra hours at work, determined to make up for the money that had been taken from us. It wasn't easy, but there was a sense of purpose in it, a determination that fueled me, a quiet resolve that grew stronger with each passing day. Connor, too, seemed to sense the change in our lives, though he never asked about his grandfather's absence. Instead, he threw himself into his studies, working harder than ever, as if he understood, in some unspoken way, the sacrifices we were making for him. And as I watched him grow, watched him blossom into the young man I'd always dreamed he'd become, I felt a renewed sense of hope, a belief that perhaps, despite everything, we would be okay. Over time, the anger and resentment I'd felt toward Henry began to fade, replaced by a quiet sadness, a regret for the man he'd once been, the man I'd once loved. I couldn't bring myself to hate him, couldn't let the bitterness consume me. Instead, I chose to remember him as he was before the addiction took hold, before the darkness crept in and stole him away. And in those moments of quiet reflection, I found a kind of peace, a fragile acceptance that allowed me to move forward, to let go of the pain and focus on the future that lay ahead. I knew that we still had a long way to go, that the scars of what we'd been through would never fully heal. But as I looked at my family, at the life we'd rebuilt, I knew that we would survive, that we would find a way to carry on, no matter what. In the end, we were stronger than I'd ever imagined, bound together by the love and resilience that had seen us through even the darkest of times. And as I watched Connor prepare to take his first steps into the world, I felt a sense of pride and gratitude that filled me with a quiet, unshakable hope. We had weathered the storm, and though we bore the marks of our struggle, we were still standing, still moving forward, one day at a time.